That's great. What an incredible breadth of perspectives, which is absolutely invaluable. I like it, Monique, that you ended with the role that data and evidence play, because that's such an important part of shifting the conversation, building the understanding that Alex was talking about. It's critical to be bringing that data and evidence into the conversation. I also was a little bit worried at the beginning of the presentation that you were making this look easy, because in fact in the City Planning Division we had a team of staff working on this full-time, 5 staff working full-time on this, and in part because it was a tremendous amount of complexity. You saw from Paul's presentation the way the street typology, the width of the right-of-way, the built form, the land uses shift throughout the entire corridor, which meant that there were a whole variety of precincts with a very different street typology, and that was a real challenge in introducing elements of commonality along the entire corridor. Was the fact that it wasn't like there was one street configuration that could be applied for 19 kilometers. The type and the design of the street is continually changing and shifting along those 19 kilometers. So it's a very complex design exercise as well. I'd like to begin with a question, and I think Monique has maybe answered this question already, so maybe from the 3 others on the panel, because you did make it look a little bit easy, and we know it's not easy. I'm wondering if each one of you can just give an example of something that was really, really hard about this, and how you overcame that. What did you do to address what was hard? We heard about Monique bringing the data and evidence to her board to shift and pivot the understanding of the importance of broadening the infrastructure on the street. Do each one of you have an example as well? Can you think of one? Jared, why don't you go first? You're nodding most readily.
something that was hard for the cycling advocates. I think what was difficult was in breaking down barriers, quite frankly. Ultimately, this idea that when we go back to 2012, and I've said that once before, but when we go back to 2012, when you thought bikes, what you thought was war on the car. That was an enormous barrier that we had to work hard at to break down. And it took, quite frankly, it took years to contribute to changing the dialogue and changing the conversation around that. So within this process, it meant we had this idea, Paul had shown up in his gorgeous suit. And he showed up at one of these meetings, and he was fast-talking his way through about how we can make this happen. And I was like, oh, Paul, this is incredible. We can actually do this. We can actually, as a vision for Eglinton, we can make this a reality. But it was just the bike advocates that he was talking to. And it was realizing that if we're going to do this, we've got to go way beyond conventional bike activism, sort of bike activism 1.0. And we were going to have to reach out and reach across the table and ultimately foster an understanding of why this was good for everyone. And that was a real challenge. So creating a process and overcoming obstacles, building relationships. I mean, that's all, at the end of the day, why this thing moves in the way it does, is because there was broad relationships that were built. But those take time, and they take energy. It's classic, in many ways, it's classic community organizing. And it's essential for making a project move. So I guess that, in many ways, I hope that answers your question, Jennifer.
Alex?
So I think, from my perspective, and it really touches on something that we mentioned during our presentation and what Jared's just spoken of, in terms of reaching out and making sure that there is a diversity of views in the room. I know you mentioned that there's real challenges where, at a BIA, there's one person doing everything, making sure that they can find the time, and that BIA, any group sees that it's important to come to a meeting, can take a lot of groundwork. We had initially started off with a series of meetings for local businesses, and those were just, as Monique mentioned, we sent out emails. I think we mailed out flyers to all the businesses along Eglinton. And there was a fair number of people, but not as many as we expected. So we thought we should change up the strategy a little bit and target representatives, the VIAs themselves, thinking that they could hear some information and bring it back to their constituencies. Nevertheless, at some of the meetings, we weren't able to get out every single VIA. And we had considered going to the BIAs, going to an AGM, or going to one of their meetings to present to them. And that's something that the city had done with different stakeholder groups. At the same time, though, by doing that, you're missing out on the opportunity to build relationships, which in this project, I think, as we've heard, ended up being so critical. And even beyond that now, that's like it's on the meeting with Fabia. So I think it was, in many projects, it's not only about having an open consultation process, but also about getting the key people in the room.
So I'll maybe build a bit on Jared's example, which may turn into some specific examples, but I think the biggest challenge we had is the sort of absolute positions that people were coming from that were sort of driven by a lack of information and a kind of perceived simplicity to a solution. So to put that in real words, a lot of cyclists came out and said, you know what, if you just got rid of that damn on-street parking, we'd have the space for the bike lane, not understanding that it's only off-peak parking and then reverts to a bus lane during rush hour. A lot of the business owners said, how can we do this? We need our loading, we need our garbage out, it doesn't work, it'll never work, but not understanding that that's a temporal condition. And so a lot of the exercises tried to get away from the basic cross-section, which was a starting point, move it into a two-dimensional, at least representation and plan, and then ultimately understanding that these things shift through time. And that, really the first stage, we came with no options. The card exercise was really mostly about education. And I think if you give people the benefit of the doubt, people were very quickly not playing by the rules, stacking things, talking about what was rush hour, what was off-peak, burying parking, extending the page of the cross-section to get off-street parking. And that knowledge is there, and I think if you can kind of inform people, they will come to the kind of compromises that are probably things you haven't even thought of as a professional, whether you're an engineer or architect or designer.
But the reality is that can be a real slog. You know, it was really fun to see you present this, Alex, because I do a very similar presentation, and yours as well. But I have a whole series of slides where we go through in great detail the consultations. We held over 60 meetings, in-person meetings, 60 over a 2-year period. That's a reflection of that slog. The relationship building, you hear this, oh, you have to build relationships with people. It's a lot of work and a lot of face time having those conversations. I'm wondering, and maybe Monique will start with you this time, that idea of that Alex talked about of having different kinds of ways of connecting with different players in the process. So there were consultations with the BIA, consultations with Cycle Toronto. Then there were large events where hundreds and hundreds of people came. Tell us a little bit more about what was effective with BIA, with your BIA members. We know the data that presentation was. Were there other things that contributed to building that understanding with the BIA? And I ask this question because the work that Monique did was really seminal. It was landmark in shifting the thinking, and I actually think it now sets the stage for other BIAs across the entire city to recognize, and this is a complete shift in thinking, recognizing that they were over projecting or understanding how people actually came into their store. That's a really big shift. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the other ways in this process that you were able to shift the thinking and to bring the conversation along?
Well, I know, actually, I wanted to mention this to Alex and Paul. The way the consultation process was actually designed, I found it very helpful to someone who really wasn't that familiar with the different pieces that were involved. I believe they had come up with categories, things like greening Eglinton and dealing with the mid-rise, high-rise stuff, that sort of stuff. That was really helpful to me, and that made it easier for me going back to the BIA to put it into the same categories again and explain it back to the board. The other thing that I found helpful was, it was gone right out of my head. It was breaking it down into papers, and there was, oh, I remember now. You had these giant images of what the street could look like. They were artist representations with, if the cyclist lane was in between the curb and the road, and if it was in between the road and the store, sorry, I can't remember now. At any rate, they were pictorial representations, and at one of the meetings, it was the last meeting, and I said, could I possibly possibly take these sheets with me? And one of you guys said, sure, go ahead. And I went back to the board and I put it out and I showed them. I said, look, these are the options that they showed us, and this is what they suggested, and this is where I think the consensus went. And it was so much easier for me to be able to convey that back with all of this material. I really think that they did a fabulous job of doing it. Like, it was material that could have been, I guess, boring if it hadn't been made a little more interesting. The other thing that I found helpful was when they moved us from room to room and created movement in between the different consultations. Because otherwise you're sitting in one spot, hearing this, all of this information all in one way. And it just helps to create your mind thinking as you move from one section to the next. It was a smaller group. I wasn't as afraid to ask what is whatever, as the case might be, because it was a smaller group. So I like that as well.
So what Monique is referring to are consultations where in a high school, there was a keynote presentation in the auditorium. And then almost like at a conference when you have breakout groups, different rooms with greening Eglinton, which was one of the themes, another group around building Eglinton, looking at the built form, another group looking at the streetscape design, doing the exercise. So a series of different workshops that people could move around to, all in the course of one evening, which, I thought that was really, really effective as well. Any questions from the floor? We'll take one from the floor. Go ahead.
Want to read it out?
I can read it out, or you can... Excellent question. Is there a difference between suburban, for example in Scarborough, and downtown or inner city acceptance of this project? And Paul mentioned that this goes right through the heart of one of our densest centers, which is Yonge and Eglinton, which is one of the fastest growing areas in the entire region, where we're exceeding our growth targets. But then we have suburban sprawl. You saw the image of the power centers along the street in Scarborough. Any comments from the panelists?
I can start with that and basically say actually no. And there's a unique sort of technical issue around the way some of this work was done, is that the cross sections for the Scarborough section were actually established in a previous EA that looked at the LRT, and they identified the need for only basic painted bike lanes, just a stripe 1.5 meters, done. And then we went through this entire process for the central section downtown where it's underground, and we looked at getting fully grade separated, buffered, all of this. And then the salt back to Scarborough was, I'm sorry, we can't fix it, it's in the EA, we're not going to reopen it. I mean, you can probably correct me, Jen, but I think right now, everyone in the local planners is complaining, why did they get the fully grade separated when we wanted to put in a buffer, at least get a rumble strip, put in some boulders? What can we do without treating an EA to not miss this opportunity?
Any other comments? Alex, from your perspective?
I can speak to the results of the surveys and caveat that they weren't, they were sort of voluntarily filled out. They weren't, specifically sitting and not done via phone call. But throughout all those surveys, in addition to asking questions on the content, would you like to see bike lanes? What do you think about removing vehicle lanes and so forth? We asked questions about demographics. And then we looked at those the questions on content to see, was there any less support for bike lanes amongst those who said that they primarily travel along Eglinton by car. And with each of the modes of travel, there was no difference. So I know this isn't, those who travel by car isn't a perfect proxy for urban areas, but nevertheless, there was a steady level of support across the many different ways that people said they traveled across Eglinton.
I guess the only other thing I'd add is that as a part of our engagement process, a key part of that was encouraging our board groups to identify individuals within the group who would hold this project with respect to their relationship with the local councillor. And so with this broad federation of groups across Toronto, one of those groups in Ward 35, local councillor named Michelle Berardinetti, and of course she ran in 2010 on removing bike lanes on Pharmacy and Birchmount. She was also, to Paul's point, the one ultimately who, through working with the board group, came back championing this idea of extending protected bike lanes into Scarborough. So I guess, times are changing. A part of that, though, is because that they're hearing directly from their constituents. So I guess,
Well, that's actually a good note to end on, and I'll end it by way of telling you a little story. I have the great pleasure as the chief planner sitting in the front of the council chamber during the city council meetings, which typically last anywhere from 3 to 4 days. It's a slog. And during that time, an amazing thing happens. There's hundreds and hundreds of items on the agenda. The last city council meeting, which was a particularly large one because it was the end of the term, there were 400 items on the agenda, and about 250 of those reports were city planning reports. So that means I'm in the room the entire time, and I respond to questions, and I help councillors write motions, and we try to resolve issues. We get them to support a project or a proposal, to move it forward in some way. And in the various times that this came forward in front of City Council, which was every council meeting over the last 4 council meetings, we had another report reporting out on this each time, usually every time dealing with different material, but every time it tended to go back to the same issues. A very interesting thing happens when you're sitting there in the council chamber. The clerk is continually distributing letters from the public. People indicating why they support something or why they don't support some item that's in front of them. And because you're sitting there in the council chamber for, a good 3 or 4 days, you read these letters. You read almost all of them. I read tons of them. I read all of the ones that pertain to my items because I'm sitting there and it gets distributed and I take a look at it. I read it and I put it in the appropriate stack. So on Eglinton Connects, when it first came forward, and this was when we were considering the streetscape plan, so the design of the cycling infrastructure, the green trackway, letters started arriving. Despite everything you've heard here today, these were not supportive letters. In fact, there was not a single supportive letter. Not one. Not a single supportive letter. They were all letters complaining about the loss of left-hand turn lanes, the concern about reduced vehicular capacity. They were all letters that were from a relatively well-organized lobby against the project. Now, we had a problem on our hands. I had a very big problem on my hands because I knew, as the 4 individuals in front of you today know, that they attended meetings where thousands of people supported this project, and yet we were getting hundreds of letters from people who didn't. And I tell you this story because it's critical not to assume that we've built capacity or understanding around an idea to the extent that it's going to move forward. Even some of the references that have been made today, I have a very different perspective because I'm on that council floor and I see the things that people do and the things they try to kill on the council floor. And I say this in part because building understanding and a breadth of understanding and an ownership over a future vision of the city is a critical part in being successful, no matter what your capacity is. And that means having a lot of hard conversations, but those conversations never go away. They need to be sustained on an ongoing basis. When I became the chief planner, I launched a website. It's a blog. It's called Own Your City. And one of the reasons that I did that was because I recognized this incredibly difficult task of building a city is something that we share. Those 60 meetings, they all mattered. And there's going to be many, many more as we move forward. And they're all going to matter too. This is at the heart of our democracy. And it's difficult. We take, in this city, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And with a project like Eglinton Connects, I believe firmly that continuing to build capacity and support for an understanding of how this is critical to the future city, to a sustainable city, is really where the depth of our effort needs to lie. I have a tremendous amount of respect for what you do, Paul, but I agree, you do the easy work. The design is the easy work. The design is the easy work, and sometimes we fight about the design, but getting the design right is much less challenging than building sustained ownership over a clear vision for the kind of city that we're trying to create. And Eglinton Connects was very much a vision-driven process, but I'm far from believing that our work is done in getting it built. So thank you very much to our panelists for your insight, your expertise, but more importantly, for the great work that you've done on behalf of your city over the course of the past 2 years. When I'm sitting there on the council floor, when I stand up to answer questions, I'm relying on a whole network of players who've done great work to bring an idea forward. So I thank you for the support that you've provided this city in creating complete streets. Thank you.